The emergency lights flashed red across the massive hall of HFY Station as delegates from 47 different worlds gathered in panic. Ambassador Velthar stretched his crystalline limbs and tried to make sense of the reports flooding in from every corner of the galaxy. The humans were gone. Not dead, not defeated in some great battle, just gone. Minho Park had been the last human anyone had seen. 3 days ago, he stood at this very podium and delivered what everyone thought was just another boring diplomatic speech. His words echoed in Velthar's memory now like a death sentence for the galaxy. The Terran Federation is withdrawing from all galactic affairs effective immediately. We wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Figure it out yourselves. At the time, the other delegates had laughed. Some even applauded, thinking humanity was finally giving up their annoying habit of interfering in everyone else's business. The Velkothi representative had actually cheered, shouting about how his people would finally be free to expand their territory without human interference. Now that same delegate sat silent in his chair, his insect-like eyes darting nervously around the room. Nari Kim walked through the abandoned human settlement on Kepler 7, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. She had been studying human culture for 20 years, and nothing prepared her for what she found here. The humans had left everything behind. Fusion reactors still hummed with power. Automated farms continued growing food that no one would harvest. Even their weapons remained in their storage facilities, untouched and ready for use. It made no sense to any logical mind. These settlements represented centuries of work and trillions of credits in infrastructure. Humans had terraformed dead worlds, built massive space stations, and created trade networks that connected every corner of the galaxy. Then they just walked away from all of it like it meant nothing. Nari picked up a child's toy from one of the empty homes. It was a small model of a human starship, the kind children played with while dreaming of exploring the stars. She wondered if the human children who lived here had been excited about leaving, or if they even understood what was happening. The toy felt warm in her hands, and she realized she was probably one of the last non-humans to touch something a human child had treasured. Back on HFY, the Velkothi delegate finally spoke up. His voice buzzed with the strange harmony his species used when they were excited about violence. Now we can finally reclaim the systems they stole from us 300 years ago. The humans always said they were keeping peace, but they were just keeping us weak. Now we are free. Other delegates nodded in agreement. The crystalline Zephyrians talked about expanding their territory beyond the limits humans had imposed. The machine world processors discussed claiming the rich asteroid, belts that humans had declared off-limits for mining. Everyone seemed to think humanity's departure was the best thing that could happen to the galaxy. Everyone except Jiwan Choi. Jiwan had worked with humans for 30 years. She had been part of mixed engineering teams that built the great space stations and terraforming installations that made modern galactic civilization possible. While her fellow Altarians celebrated humanity's withdrawal, she sat in her workshop and felt a cold fear growing in her chest. She remembered the conversations she had overheard between human engineers. They spoke often about something they called the balance. At first, she thought they meant the balance between different technologies or the balance needed for stable orbital mechanics. But over the years, she realized they meant something much bigger and more frightening. Humans had spent 3 centuries carefully managing every aspect of galactic civilization. They mediated disputes before they became wars. They monitored trade routes to prevent piracy. They watched for signs of dangerous expansion by aggressive species and quietly redirected those ambitions toward harmless competition. They had been the invisible hand that kept 47 different species from destroying each other and themselves. Now that hand was gone. The first signs of trouble came within hours of humanity's departure. Pirates attacked a convoy in the Outer Rim, something that had not happened in 50 years. The hive clusters, strange insect-like beings that humans had kept contained to 3-star systems, sent out their first scout ships in decades. Border. Disputes that had been frozen for generations suddenly flared back to life as species tested whether the old agreements would still be enforced. They would not be enforced. There was no one left to enforce them. Velthar received a message from his homeworld that made his crystalline body pulse with worry. Zephyrian mining ships had been detected in the neutral zone between their territory and Velkothi space. The Velkothi had responded by mobilizing their bioweapon fleets. Both sides were demanding that the Galactic Trade Federation take action, to force the other to back down. But the Federation had no power to force anyone to do anything. For 3 centuries, their authority had been backed by the implicit threat of human intervention. Everyone knew that if you pushed too hard, if you broke too many rules, if you threatened galactic stability, the humans would come. They would come with their massive fleets and their terrible weapons and their absolute refusal to accept defeat. They would stop you, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Now they were gone, and the Federation was just a collection of politicians, with no way to enforce their decisions. The emergency session stretched into its 2nd day as reports poured in from across the galaxy. The hive clusters had broken through their containment barriers and were expanding into previously forbidden systems. Pirate fleets were forming in the lawless regions that humans used to patrol. Ancient territorial disputes were erupting into violence as species realized no one was coming to stop them. Nari Kim found herself appointed as head of a new committee tasked with understanding why humans had left and whether they might return. She accepted the position knowing it was probably hopeless. In all her years studying human culture, she had learned one thing above all others. When humans made a decision, they stuck to it. They did not bluff, they did not make empty threats, and they did not change their minds once they had committed to a course of action. The humans were gone, and they were not coming back. As she prepared her first report for the panicking Federation Council, Nari tried to imagine what would happen next. Without human peacekeepers, how long would it take for old enemies to return to war? Without human trade regulations, how long before the economy collapsed into chaos? Without human exploration fleets discovering new worlds and resources, how long before competition for existing territory became violent? She did not want to think about the answers to those questions, but she knew she would find out soon enough. The galaxy was about to remember what it had been like before humans arrived to impose their version of order. It was about to remember why that order had been necessary in the first place. The great silence had begun, and in that silence, she could already hear the first whispers of the chaos that was coming. 6 months had passed since the humans disappeared, and the galaxy burned with a violence not seen in 3 centuries. Admiral Daiho Yoon stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching enemy bioships tear through his defensive line like paper. The mixed fleet under his command fought with desperate courage, but they lacked the perfect coordination that human-led forces had always displayed. The Velkothi hegemony had wasted no time after humanity's departure. Their first target was the agricultural world of HFY, home to 12 million peaceful colonists. The Velkothi bioweapons turned the planet's atmosphere into poison within hours. Every living thing on the surface died in agony, while Velkothi forces claimed the mineral-rich core for their expanding empire. That had been just the beginning. Daiho watched another of his ships explode in a ball of green fire as Velkothi biocannons found their mark. The enemy used weapons that human treaties had banned for good reason, living weapons that grew stronger by consuming the wreckage of destroyed ships, viral bombs that turned entire crews into mindless zombies serving the hive mind, Predator, organisms designed to hunt down survivors hiding in escape pods. His communications officer, a young Altarian named Soyeon Lee, reported incoming transmission from the remaining Federation worlds. Her voice shook with exhaustion and fear as she read the latest casualty reports. 15 worlds had fallen to various conflicts in the past month alone. The death toll had passed the billion mark and continued climbing with each passing day. Thus, Zephyrian response to Velkothi expansion had been swift and terrible. Their crystalline ships could manipulate stellar energy, and they chose to make an example of the Velkothi homeworld by causing its sun to go supernova. The explosion wiped out an entire star system and sent deadly radiation across neighboring regions. But instead of deterring the Velkothi, it had only made them more desperate and more willing to use their most horrible weapons. Deho remembered the briefings he had attended as a junior officer serving under human commanders. The humans had always emphasized something they called escalation control. Every response to aggression had to be carefully measured to prevent conflicts from spiraling out of control. Use too little force and enemies would see weakness. Use too much force and they would panic into increasingly desperate actions. Without human oversight, no one remembered how to manage that delicate balance. Every attack led to a more violent counterattack. Every atrocity was answered with a worse atrocity. The galaxy was locked in a cycle of violence that fed on itself and grew stronger with each passing day. On the trading station Nexus 7, Soyeon Lee watched the collapse of galactic civilization happen in real time. As head of the station's economic council, she had a front-row seat to the death of 3 centuries of carefully built prosperity. The first thing to go was trust. Traders who had done business together for generations suddenly demanded payment in advance and refused to accept credit from species they considered potential enemies. Currency exchange rates fluctuated wildly as entire economic regions became war zones. The interstellar banking system, built on the assumption that human peacekeepers would prevent major conflicts, began to collapse as clients defaulted on loans. They could never repay. Shipping lanes that had been safe for centuries became hunting grounds for pirates and raiders. The great trade routes that connected the galaxy's economic centers were cut one by one as worlds withdrew behind defensive barriers. Merchant ships traveled in heavily armed convoys or did not travel at all. Soyeon watched a Zephyrian trade delegation abandon negotiations with the Altarian Republic after news arrived that Zephyrian colonies were under attack. The carefully negotiated agreement would have provided rare crystals needed for medical equipment in exchange for food shipments to feed Zephyrian worlds. Without that agreement, people would die on both sides, but fear and anger had made cooperation impossible. She tried to remember the last time she had seen human trade negotiators work. They had a gift for finding solutions that made everyone feel like they were winning, even when they were actually making compromises. More importantly, everyone knew that agreements reached under human supervision would be enforced. That certainty had been the foundation of galactic commerce. Now that foundation was gone, and the entire economic structure was collapsing. The diplomatic situation was even worse. Taehyung-oh had been one of the galaxy's most respected mediators before the humans left. He had helped resolve dozens of conflicts using techniques he learned from human diplomats. But those techniques only worked when both sides believed there would be consequences for breaking agreements. His latest assignment took him to the border between Velkothi and Processor territories, where a minor dispute over mining rights was escalating toward open warfare. Under human oversight, such disputes were resolved through binding arbitration. The humans would study the situation, hear arguments from both sides, and render a decision that everyone accepted because everyone knew the humans had the power and will to enforce it. Taehyung had no such power. He could offer compromise solutions and appeal to both sides' better nature, but when push came to shove, everyone knew he commanded no fleets and controlled no weapons. His words carried no weight because they were backed by no force. The Processor Collective rejected his proposed settlement and began building military installations on the disputed asteroids. The Velkothi responded by releasing bioweapons that consumed the processor mining equipment. Within days, the miner dispute had become another front in the galaxy's expanding wars. Dr. Hyaron Park made the most terrifying discovery of all in her xenobiology laboratory on Kepler Station. She had been studying tissue samples from Hive Cluster, organisms found in the outer systems, trying to understand why they had suddenly become so much more aggressive after centuries of containment. What she found in her genetic analysis made her hands shake as she prepared her report for the Federation. Science Council. The Hive clusters were not just expanding randomly. They were following a carefully planned biological imperative that had been triggered by some external factor. The trigger appeared to be the absence of specific pheromone markers that human presence had provided. For 300 years, human colonies and ships had been releasing chemical signatures that told hive cluster organisms to remain dormant. The humans had never mentioned this to anyone, but the evidence was clear in the genetic code. They had been conducting a galaxy-wide biological containment program without anyone else knowing about it. Now that the human chemical markers were fading from the galactic environment, the hive clusters were entering their expansion phase for the first time since humans arrived in their territory. Their bioships were growing larger and more aggressive. Their reproduction rate was accelerating. Worst of all, they appeared to be developing new capabilities as they consumed the abandoned human installations they encountered. Hyaron's calculations suggested that if current trends continued, the hive clusters would consume every living world in the galaxy within 50 years. They had been an extinction-level threat all along, and only human intervention had prevented galactic annihilation. But the humans were gone, and they had taken their protective measures with them. As reports continued flooding in from across the galaxy, a terrible picture emerged. The Velkothi had conquered 23 systems and showed no signs of slowing down. The Zephyrians were destabilizing stars throughout the outer rim in their pursuit of total war. The hive clusters were spreading through undefended regions, like a biological plague. Pirate fleets controlled major shipping lanes. Entire sectors were going dark as civilizations retreated behind defensive barriers and cut off communication with the outside galaxy. The Federation tried to organize a response, but they faced an impossible situation. Every species was fighting for survival, and none were willing to risk their remaining forces to help others. The spirit of cooperation that humans had carefully nurtured for 3 centuries evaporated in the face of existential threats. In her final report before Kepler, station was evacuated, Narration wrote the words that would define this dark period of galactic history. "We are discovering that we were never partners with humanity. We were children under their protection, and now we are orphans learning how cruel the galaxy can be." 2 years after humanity vanished, the galaxy looked like a battlefield where gods had fought and lost. Junho Song guided his refugee fleet through the debris field that had once been the Centauri system, where 15 billion souls had lived, before the Zephyrians and Velkothi decided to settle their differences with planet-cracking weapons. The fleet under his protection consisted of survivors from dozens of different worlds, all fleeing the violence that had consumed their homes. Families who had never seen war suddenly found themselves homeless wanderers in a galaxy that no longer recognized the concept of neutral territory or safe passage. Children asked when they could go home, and adults had no answers to give them. Junho's destination was Terra Nova, one of the oldest human colonies and the last place anyone had detected human activity before the Great Departure. His hope was to find some clue about why the humans had left and whether they planned to return. His fear was that he would find only more empty buildings and abandoned dreams. What he found was much more disturbing. The human city on Terra Nova was intact, but completely deserted, just like every other human settlement across the galaxy. But hidden beneath the administrative center was something no one had expected to discover: a vast underground complex filled with data storage units and quantum computers still humming with power. Dr. Yunji Kong, one of the few xenoarchaeologists who had worked closely with human researchers, began the delicate work of accessing the human database systems. What she found in those files changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about the past 3 centuries. The humans had been watching everything, every trade negotiation, every territorial dispute, every scientific breakthrough, every military exercise conducted by every species in the galaxy had been carefully monitored and recorded. The database contained detailed psychological profiles of entire civilizations, predictions about how different species would react to various situations, and contingency plans for managing conflicts before they became wars. But most shocking of all were the intervention records. File after file documented human activities that had prevented disasters no one else even knew had been possible. Wars that never started because human agents quietly eliminated the sources of conflict. Genocides that never happened because human peacekeepers arrived just in time to separate opposing forces. Economic collapses that were averted by carefully timed human investments and trade agreements. Yunji discovered that the Great Plague of 2387, which everyone believed had been stopped by cooperative medical research, had actually been ended by human bioscientists who developed the cure in secret, and then allowed other species to take credit for the discovery. The Zephyrian Civil War that lasted only 6 months instead of the predicted 6 decades had been shortened by human diplomats who worked behind the scenes to broker peace. Even the discovery of faster-than-light travel had been guided by human scientists who shared key breakthroughs while making it seem like natural scientific progress. The database revealed the true scope of human manipulation of galactic affairs. They had not been partners or even leaders in the traditional sense. They had been puppeteers, carefully pulling strings to make the other species believe they were making their own decisions, while actually following paths that humans had designed to maintain peace and prosperity. Seungmin Lim read through the military files with growing horror. As a former attaché to human forces, he had always wondered how human commanders seemed to know exactly what their enemies would do before those enemies knew it themselves. Now he understood that humans had been using psychological warfare on a galactic scale, studying every species so thoroughly that they could predict and counter any possible threat before it materialized. The Velkothi expansion that had seemed so sudden and unexpected after humanity's departure had actually been planned by Velkothi military leaders for over 50 years. The humans knew about it and had been quietly sabotaging Velkothi efforts to build the bioweapons needed for their conquest. They had infiltrated Velkothi society so completely that they could have destroyed the entire species at any time, but instead chose to simply prevent them from becoming a threat to others. Similar files existed for every species in the galaxy. The Zephyrians' stellar manipulation technology had been deliberately limited by human interference that made certain key discoveries seem impossible. The hive cluster expansion protocols had been suppressed by chemical agents that humans had been secretly releasing for centuries. Even the peaceful trading nations had been carefully managed to prevent them from developing technologies or alliances that might threaten galactic stability. The humans had been playing a game so complex that no other species had even realized it was being played. Seungmin organized what he called the Terran Protocol, an attempt to use the information in the human databases to restore some measure of order to the galaxy. Teams of specialists studied human intervention techniques and tried to apply them to current crises, but they quickly discovered why humanity had been so effective and why no one else could replicate their success. Human influence had depended on 3 things that no other species possessed. First was their reputation for absolute retaliation. Everyone knew that attacking human interests would result in swift and overwhelming punishment. Second was their technological superiority. Human weapons and defenses were so advanced that resistance was futile for any potential enemy. Third was their unique psychology that allowed them to remain emotionally detached while wielding enormous power. Other species lacked all three advantages. The Zephyrians were powerful but prone to emotional decisions. The processors were logical but lacked the military strength to enforce their will. The Altarians were diplomatic but had no credible threat to back up their negotiations. No single species could fill the role that humans had played, and cooperation between species had become impossible in the current climate of fear and violence. Meanwhile, the threats to galactic civilization continued growing worse. The hive clusters had consumed an entire spiral arm of the galaxy and were accelerating their expansion. Their bioships now spanned entire star systems and could strip a world of all life in a matter of days. More terrifying still, they appeared to be developing intelligence as they grew larger, showing signs of strategic thinking that made them far more dangerous than mindless consumers. The Velkothi had responded to mounting pressure by deploying their ultimate weapon, a virus designed to target silicon-based life forms. Since roughly half the galaxy's species used silicon in their biology, this was effectively a declaration of war against half of known civilization. The virus spread through trade routes and communication networks, causing entire worlds to fall. Silent as their populations died in agony, the Zephyrian response was even more extreme. Faced with extinction, they began a project to destabilize the galactic core itself. Their plan was to trigger a cascade collapse that would create a supermassive black hole at the center of the galaxy. Their reasoning was that if they were going to die, they would take everyone else with them rather than allow their enemies to inherit the galaxy. As Minseo Park led the last Federation fleet in a desperate attempt to slow the hive cluster advance, she received a message that changed everything. It came from the edge of known space, from a region where no civilization had ever established colonies. The message was brief and used human communication protocols that had not been seen for over 2 years. "We have been monitoring your progress. You have 6 months to prove you can govern yourselves without destroying everything we helped you build. After that, we will decide whether this galaxy is worth saving or whether it should be allowed to consume itself." It was signed with the seal of the Terran Federation and transmitted from coordinates that placed the sender somewhere beyond the galactic rim. The humans had not left after all. They had been watching from the shadows, observing their former charges struggle with independence. The question now was whether the galaxy's survivors could pass whatever test humanity had designed for them, or whether they would fail and face consequences that no one wanted to imagine. As news of the human message spread across the surviving worlds, reactions ranged from relief to terror. Some saw it as hope that salvation might still be possible. Others viewed it as a threat that proved humans had never really cared about galactic civilization, except as an experiment to satisfy their own curiosity. But everyone understood one thing clearly: the galaxy had 6 months to prove it could survive, without human guidance. If they failed that test, they might discover that being abandoned by humanity was not the worst fate that could befall them. The countdown to judgment had begun, and every surviving world in the galaxy felt the weight of humanity's ultimatum. Woojin Kim found himself elected as emergency coordinator of what remained of the Galactic Federation, a position that made him responsible for preventing the complete destruction of civilized space in just 6 months. His first challenge was convincing bitter enemies to work together when they had spent 2 years trying to destroy each other. The Velkothi delegation refused to attend peace talks with Zephyrians who had murdered billions of their people. The Zephyrians demanded war crimes trials for Velkothi leaders who had deployed biological weapons. Every species had grievances against every other species, and all of them were running out of time. Woojin's breakthrough came when Uniseo made the most important discovery in the Terra Nova archives. Hidden beneath layers of encrypted files was humanity's greatest secret, a complete psychological analysis of every galactic species, including detailed predictions of exactly how each would behave without human oversight. The humans had known this would happen. They had calculated the probability of galactic war, estimated casualty figures, and predicted which species would survive the chaos. But most importantly, they had designed the entire crisis as a test to determine whether the galaxy's civilizations were capable of maturing beyond their violent instincts. The test had multiple levels. The first level was survival, which most species had managed despite enormous losses. The second level was cooperation, which required former enemies to work together against common threats. The third level was sacrifice, which demanded that species give up short-term advantages for long-term stability. Only by passing all three levels could the galaxy prove it was ready for true independence from human guidance. Yuna's analysis revealed that humans had left behind a network of hidden installations throughout the galaxy designed to activate only when certain conditions were met. These installations contained advanced technology capable of stopping the hive cluster expansion, neutralizing the Velkothi bioweapons, and stabilizing the stellar cascade that threatened the galactic core. But the technology would only activate if the galaxy's species demonstrated genuine cooperation rather than temporary alliances of convenience. Dongyuk Lee commanded the defense of Sanctuary Station, the last major trade hub still operating in the galaxy. His mixed fleet included ships from 17 different species, all working together under unified command for the first time since humanity's departure. The cooperation was fragile and sometimes broke down over cultural misunderstandings or old prejudices, but it was real progress compared to the chaos of the past 2 years. When hive cluster bioships approached Sanctuary Station, Dongyuk discovered that human communication protocols were still embedded in the station's computer systems. Activating those protocols revealed hidden defensive capabilities that had been installed centuries ago but never used. Automated weapon platforms emerged from asteroids throughout the system, all powered by technology more advanced than anything the current galaxy possessed. But the weapons would not fire automatically. They required authorization codes from representatives of at least 20 different species, all working together in perfect coordination. It was a test of trust and cooperation that would have been impossible during the height of the galactic wars, but desperation had taught former enemies the value of working together. The defense of Sanctuary Station became a symbol of what was possible when species put aside their differences. Zephyrian crystal technology provided power for Velkothi bioshields that protected processor computational cores running Altarian coordination software. Every species contributed their unique abilities to create a defensive system stronger than any single civilization could have built alone. Jisoo Nam, who had served as a translator during the human era, realized that the various species needed to abandon more than just their territorial ambitions. They needed to change their fundamental assumptions about how galactic civilization should work. The old system had been hierarchical, with humans at the top and everyone else competing for position below them. The new system would need to be truly cooperative, with decisions made through consensus rather than imposed by superior force. This realization led to the formation of the Galactic Cooperative Council, a new governing body that replaced the old Federation structure. Instead of having dominant and subordinate members, every species had equal voice in decisions that affected them. Instead of majority rule, they used consensus-building techniques that ensured everyone's concerns were addressed before implementing new policies. The breakthrough moment came when Young Ho-an successfully negotiated an unprecedented alliance between the Velkothi hegemony and their traditional enemies. The Velkothi agreed to share their bioweapon technology, not for conquest, but for defense against the hive clusters. In exchange, former enemies provided the Velkothi with new worlds to replace those they had lost in the wars, along with technological assistance to rebuild their civilization without relying on biological weapons. For the first time in galactic history, species were voluntarily sharing their most powerful technologies and most valuable resources without expecting immediate payment or strategic advantage. They were learning to think in terms of mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. The transformation was not easy or complete. Centuries of mistrust and competition could not be overcome in a few months, and there were still incidents of violence and betrayal. But the overall trend was toward cooperation, driven by the recognition that everyone would die if they failed to work together. So Choi made the decision to activate the first human failsafe system, revealing the true extent of humanity's hidden influence on galactic civilization. Automated platforms throughout the galaxy came online, powered by dark matter manipulation technology that no other species had even theorized was possible. These platforms had been maintaining crucial services like interstellar communication networks and gravitational stability in star systems, but they had done so invisibly to avoid creating dependence. Now the platforms revealed themselves and offered their services to the Galactic Cooperative Council, but only if the Council could prove it was capable of using such power responsibly. This meant establishing oversight mechanisms to prevent any single species from gaining control, creating ethical guidelines for the use of advanced technology, and demonstrating that cooperation was sustainable rather than just a temporary response to crisis. The final test came when the hive clusters reached the galaxy's core systems and began consuming the ancient worlds where galactic civilization had first developed. Every species in the galaxy had historical connections to these worlds, and their loss would represent the end of millions of years of cultural evolution. The solution required sacrifice on a scale never before seen in galactic history. Species that had hoarded resources for centuries opened their strategic reserves. Civilizations that had never allowed outsiders into their territory welcomed refugees from devastated worlds. Military forces that had been designed to fight each other combined into unified fleets under joint command. Most remarkably, the Zephyrians abandoned their project to destabilize the galactic core and instead used their stellar manipulation technology to create safe corridors through hive cluster territory. This allowed evacuation fleets to rescue populations from doomed worlds, even though it meant the Zephyrians had to give up their ultimate weapon and trust their former enemies not to take advantage of their vulnerability. As the 6-month deadline approached, the galaxy had transformed itself in ways that would have seemed impossible when the crisis began. Former enemies had become allies. Competing civilizations had learned cooperation, and species that had never trusted outsiders were working together as partners in a shared future. But the ultimate test still lay ahead. Somewhere beyond the galactic rim, humanity watched and judged whether their former charges had truly learned wisdom or were simply responding to immediate threats with temporary cooperation that would collapse once the crisis passed. The 6th month arrived with the galaxy transformed beyond recognition, but whether the transformation would be enough remained to be seen. Jonghoon Park stood on the bridge of the volunteer fleet, preparing for what everyone assumed would be a suicide mission into the heart of hive cluster space. His ships carried no weapons of mass destruction, no planet-killing devices, no tools of genocide that might eliminate the threat through overwhelming violence. Instead, they carried something far more dangerous, hope that communication might succeed where warfare had failed. The hive clusters had grown beyond anyone's worst predictions. Their bioships now formed a living network that spanned entire star systems, pulsing with collective intelligence that seemed to be awakening as it consumed more and more of the galaxy. Traditional attacks had proven useless against organisms that could adapt to any weapon and grow stronger by consuming the wreckage of destroyed fleets. Jonghoon's plan was revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than trying to destroy the hive clusters, he would attempt to communicate with their emerging group consciousness and offer them something they had never been offered before: partnership instead of conflict, coexistence instead of consumption. The volunteers on his fleet came from every surviving species in the galaxy. Former enemies worked side by side, united by the understanding that success would save everyone while failure would doom all life to extinction. They had studied the hive cluster biosignatures for months, learning to modulate their ship's energy emissions to match the harmonic frequencies that seemed to carry information through the living network. As they approached the massive biostructure, at the center of hive cluster space, something unprecedented happened. The living ships that should have attacked immediately instead began to pulse in complex patterns that resembled communication attempts rather than preparation for battle. The emerging intelligence wanted to talk. Meanwhile, Da-Hyun Kim worked desperately to coordinate the galaxy's response to the stellar cascade crisis that threatened to destroy the galactic core. The Zephyrian attempt to weaponize stars had triggered an unstable chain reaction that was spreading from system to system, turning stable suns into supernovas that threatened to tear apart the fundamental structure of the galaxy itself. The solution required perfect cooperation between technologies that had never been designed to work together. Zephyrian crystal matrices had to be integrated with Velkothi biocomputers. Processor quantum calculations had to be synchronized with Altarian energy manipulation systems, and dozens of other technologies had to function as a single unified system spanning thousands of star systems. For the first time in galactic history, every major species was contributing their most advanced and closely guarded technologies to a single project controlled by joint command rather than any individual government. The level of trust required was staggering, since any species could have sabotaged the project to gain advantage over their neighbors, but none did. The stellar stabilization network they created was more advanced than anything humans had ever built, proving that cooperative effort could achieve results beyond what any single civilization could accomplish alone. When they activated the system, the cascade collapse stopped, the chain reaction reversed, and stability returned to the galactic core. But the greatest test still lay in the approaching return of humanity itself. Admiral Ha-Jin Yu commanded the human fleet that emerged from beyond the galactic rim exactly 6 months after delivering their ultimatum. The ships were larger and more advanced than any vessels the galaxy had seen during humanity's previous tenure, but they approached peacefully with all weapons powered down and no threatening moves. The galaxy that greeted humanity's return was fundamentally different from the one they had left behind. The Galactic Cooperative Council had replaced the old hierarchical federation with a system based on consensus and mutual benefit rather than competition and dominance. Former enemies had become partners in joint projects that benefited everyone involved. Species that had hoarded resources for centuries had learned the value of sharing knowledge and technology. Most importantly, the galaxy's civilizations had learned to solve their problems through cooperation rather than waiting for human intervention. They had proven they could govern themselves, protect themselves, and grow beyond their previous limitations when working together instead of against each other. Su-Young Bei, serving as humanity's chief diplomatic officer, met with the Cooperative Council on neutral HFY Station. The meeting was historic not just because it marked humanity's return, but because it established a new relationship between humans and the rest of the galaxy. For the first time in 3 centuries, humans were not automatically assumed to be in charge. They were invited to participate as partners in galactic governance rather than imposed as rulers or protectors. The Council had prepared proposals for joint research projects, cooperative exploration missions, and shared defense initiatives that treated humanity as equals rather than superiors. The change in attitude was remarkable. Where once other species had competed for human favor or chafed under human restrictions, now they offered genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. The galaxy had learned that cooperation produced better results than competition, and they wanted to apply that lesson to their relationship with humanity as well. Kyung-min. The last human ambassador to serve under the old system, was amazed by the transformation he witnessed. The same species that had celebrated humanity's departure now welcomed their return, not because they needed human protection, but because they valued human contribution to their shared future. The humans revealed their final secret during these negotiations. Their entire 3-century tenure as galactic peacekeepers had been planned from the beginning as a temporary measure designed to teach other species how to govern themselves. Every intervention, every restriction, every carefully managed crisis had been part of an educational program intended to prepare the galaxy for eventual independence. The test period after their departure had been the final examination, designed to determine whether the lessons had been learned well enough for the galaxy to survive without constant supervision. The threat of abandonment had been real, but so had been the hope that it would not be necessary. Humanity had always intended to return as partners rather than rulers, but only if the galaxy proved it was ready for that kind of relationship. The chaos and violence of the past 2 years had been painful, but necessary steps in the process of growing beyond dependence on external authority. Minji Shin watched from the observation deck of Terra Nova Station as the first joint human-alien colony ships launched toward unexplored regions beyond the galactic rim. These expeditions would establish new worlds using cooperative techniques developed during the crisis, with humans contributing their exploration expertise while other species provided technologies and perspectives that humans lacked. The galaxy that emerged from its trial by fire was stronger, wiser, and more unified than ever before. The price of that wisdom had been measured in billions of lives lost and entire worlds destroyed, but the survivors understood that the cost of remaining children under human protection would have been even higher in the long run. As new trade networks were established under joint species management and research institutes were founded with shared governance, it became clear that the galaxy had learned its most important lesson. True peace and prosperity could only be maintained through cooperation and mutual respect, not through the dominance of any single species, no matter how well-intentioned. The great test was over, and the galaxy had passed. The age of human guardianship had ended, and the age of true galactic civilization had begun. Humanity would be part of that future, but not as rulers or protectors. They would be partners in the greatest adventure of all, building a galaxy where every species could thrive while working together toward goals that none could achieve alone. The stars themselves seemed brighter as representatives from dozens of worlds worked side by side, no longer divided by ancient hatreds or competing ambitions, but united by the hard-won knowledge that their shared future depended on their willingness to trust and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead in the vast cosmos that was now truly their common home.